Hello and welcome to this episode of Alta Sciences podcast. Today we'll be discussing the requirements for preclinical safety testing of cannabinoid-derived products. My name is Joe Francisco and I'm the Chief Toxicologist here at Alta Sciences. For this podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Christina Cruzen, the Director of Laboratory Animal Resources and the attending veterinarian at our preclinical facility here in Everett, Washington. Welcome, Christina.
Thanks, Joe. I'm happy to be here with you today. On the script you provided, this is where I say, I'm your biggest fan, and it's an absolute honor to be working with you. Did I get that right?
You did a bang-up job. I'm trying to get everyone to spread the love. Before we get started, Christina, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. So I hail from the Midwest, born and raised in Wisconsin. I bleed green and gold. So after graduating from Winona State University, I attended veterinary school in Madison, Wisconsin. And it was during vet school that I was first introduced to the field of laboratory animal medicine. That was in 2001, and I've never left. So after vet school, I got my first job as a lab animal vet at the Wisconsin National Primate Research Center. And in 2012, I earned my board certification by the American College of Laboratory Animal Medicine. Shortly after that, I moved to Northern California for a new job opportunity and worked there also in the same field for about 5 years before transitioning to Washington to join the Alta Sciences team. So I've been here at Alta Sciences for just over 2 years now, and I'm currently the attending veterinarian and the chief animal welfare officer. And perhaps most pertinent to today's discussion, I'm also the DEA license holder for our institution.
Well, certainly your background brings a lot of expertise and much needed experience with non-human primates for what we do here at this facility. So, Christina, the perception of cannabis and cannabis-related products has certainly changed in recent years, especially in the United States. There's been a legalization of cannabis for recreational and medicinal purposes in over half the states here in the U.S., and I believe it's also legal in all of Canada. Even though it's legal in many states, it's still illegal at the federal level. But despite this, there's a strong interest in understanding the potential benefits of cannabis for indications such as chronic pain, chemotherapy-induced nausea, epilepsy, and spasticity related to multiple sclerosis. In fact, it's for these purposes that cannabis has been legalized in many states for medicinal reasons. So what can you tell us, Christina, about cannabis and cannabis-derived products?
Well, society certainly has learned a lot about the potential impacts of cannabis and cannabis-related products over the past several years. Scientists are continuing to evaluate all of the possible roles of the endocannabinoid system and how we can modulate our own physiology with exogenous cannabinoids. And to be honest, they've really barely uncovered the tip of the iceberg. We now know that the endocannabinoid system, the cannabinoids that our body produces naturally, plays a key role in stabilizing various physiologic processes. And we've learned a lot about its role in inflammation, anxiety, stress management, memory, a whole host of the body functions. However, these are all extremely complex processes, and we have a long way to go before we fully understand them and the impacts that exogenous cannabinoids may have on them. So there's a tremendous opportunity still for additional research in this field. Now, as you mentioned, many states have legalized the recreational use of marijuana. However, cannabis research still remains a bit tricky because although it's legal at the state level, the DEA does still consider it to be a Schedule I controlled substance in the Federal Controlled Substance Act. And Schedule I substances are the most highly regulated controlled substances that are there, and they have the strongest controls and limitations placed upon their possession. So if a substance meets the definition of marijuana, you need a special DEA license to be able to possess, administer, or analyze that substance for any research that you might be doing.
So let's dig into that a little bit further. Schedule I drugs. What does that mean with respect to conducting studies in a preclinical setting? And how do drugs that fall into the Schedule I category differ from other drugs?
Well, if we take a step back and think really big picture, the DEA determines which substance are considered legally to be controlled substances. In general, these are compounds that are usually addictive or at some risk of abuse by the human population. They might have special health considerations. And they take all of these controlled substances and they place them into categories based on a combination of these factors: their addiction risk, their abuse potential, their health risk, as well as their potential medical uses. And there are 5 different schedules that the DEA has for these controlled substances. Schedule 5 drugs are the least addictive and therefore the least regulated. This is something like perhaps codeine. Schedule 4 is a little bit less abuse potential. These are going to be things like Valium or Xanax that you may have heard of. These are controlled substances at the Schedule 4 level. Schedule 3 carries a higher risk. In my world, in the veterinary world, these are things like ketamine, which we use routinely to sedate non-human primates, but is also a street drug, so has to be controlled for that perspective. Or something like veterinary euthanasia solution would be a Schedule 3 drug. Schedule 2 drugs are actually considered to be highly, highly addictive substances with a high potential for abuse, but they are compounds that still have what the DEA calls widely accepted medical uses. So these are actually things like fentanyl or some of the other really potent narcotics, but actually Schedule 2 drugs even include something like cocaine or opium. So some of these are pretty big gun drugs. Now, all of these Schedule 2 through 5 drugs still require a DEA license, but for these, you can get something called a practitioner's license. And both human and veterinary medical practitioners, professionals, can be granted a license that allows them to prescribe drugs from the Schedule 2 through 5 categories. Schedule 1 drugs are a special case. Schedule 1 drugs are considered to be highly addictive with no official accepted medical use. Schedule 1 drugs include things like heroin, LSD, and marijuana. And since there's considered to be no accepted medical use, a doctor can't get a practitioner's license to address these compounds. Instead, they need a very specific research license to use any Schedule 1 drug.
So getting back to the topic of this podcast, cannabis. Cannabis is not one pure substance. It's made up of many different compounds. 2 of the most prominent being CBD and THC. Seems these days you can't walk into a pharmacy or a grocery store without seeing displays with CBD products or products made with CBD oil, but the same cannot be said for THC. What can you tell us about the difference between CBD and why that is readily available versus THC, which is not?
Yeah, so this is a place where semantics really do matter. And as they say, the devil really is in the details. So the specifics of the compounds that we're talking about become very, very important. And although the words can sound very similar, the definitions and restrictions placed on their use by the federal government are very specific. So cannabis is technically the name of the entire plant. And the cannabis plant itself contains more than 100 different chemicals called cannabinoids. Now, of these 100 plus cannabinoids, CBD, cannabidiol, and THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, are the 2 most common chemicals that are derived from cannabis. And those are the 2 that you mentioned. Now, in reality, the DEA doesn't even mention cannabis in their regulations. Instead, they list marijuana as the Schedule 1 drug. So we have to look to the definition of marijuana. So the definition of marijuana is specified by the USDA. And they define marijuana as any cannabis or cannabis-derived product that contains more than 0.3% tetrahydrocannabinol on a dry weight basis. So if a substance contains more than that magic number, 0.3% THC, it is a Schedule 1 drug. If it contains less than 0.3%, it's not a controlled substance at all. So CBD products generally contain well below 0.3% THC and thus are not considered to be controlled substances. And this is the basis for what you're seeing on all those grocery store shelves, gas station counters, pet stores, pretty much everywhere you go these days. Those CBD products do not contain enough THC to be considered controlled substances.
Got it. So those substances that we see in the grocery store are going to have, as you described, less than 0.3% THC. And you have to go to your dispensary if you want to get products that contain more than 0.3%.
Correct.
So with respect to preclinical drug development, so from what you've described, I would imagine that products that contain CBD, CBD oil, or CBD itself would not need any additional precautions or regulations. But products that are derived from cannabis that contain greater than 0.3% THC would need some sort of special regulations because it's controlled by the DEA. Can you explain the processes that are required to use such compounds, those that contain greater than 0.3% THC, in a preclinical setting?
Yeah, so if you're going to be testing anything that contains more than that legal cutoff, that 0.3% THC, the site conducting the actual research needs to have a Schedule I license with the DEA. Now, it's important to realize that this license is different than the other controlled substance licenses, and it is a study-specific license. So for all of the other lesser regulated controlled substances that I mentioned earlier, a facility or an individual can have sort of a standing license that allows them to order a variety of different drugs in those schedules. For anything regulated as a Schedule I substance, the license application actually includes the study-specific protocol, and the acquisition and use of that substance is limited very specifically to what's described in that protocol. To even do additional work with that same substance requires amendments to the DEA license application each and every time. So this can mean that studies working with Schedule I drugs need quite a bit more lead time as compared to a study that doesn't work with a Schedule I drug.
So let's dig into that a little bit further. As you know, and as anyone working with preclinical sites, contract research organizations knows, timelines are everything for drug development, especially to get into first-in-human studies. In my experience, protocols, and you said a protocol is required to submit for a DEA license for that particular compound. Protocols are generally not written very far in advance of the start of the study. What kind of timing are you talking about with respect to applying for a DEA license, given that that protocol needs to be available?
Yeah, so if an institution is applying for a Schedule I license for the first time, the DEA states that that applicant should expect approximately a 6-week license application review period. Now, as I said, that application has to actually include your signed FDA study protocol as well as your statement of IACUC approval. So both of those documents have to be completely finalized and ready to go before the application can be submitted, and then there's that 6-week application review period that the DEA needs. Your application also needs to specify the source of your Schedule I drug, the exact amount you need, the animals being utilized, and even the CVs of every single person listed on those protocols. So it's a pretty big task to take that on. So for most institutions, this means that the applicant, the person applying for that license, needs all of that information from the client at least 7 or 8 weeks before the drug can even be shipped to the institution. So it is a pretty big change from our normal turnaround times. And I also should point out that this assumes that the applicant already meets the state requirements of possessing controlled substances in general, and usually also means that they already have a license for Schedules 2 through 5. The DEA can move those through a little more quickly because they know that you already meet the requirements for those other controlled substances.
And just to clarify, by the applicant, you said the applicant must have the permission or ability to use Schedule 2 through 5 drugs. You mean the site that would be conducting the studies, not the sponsor of the studies that is trying to develop that THC-based drug, correct?
That's correct, yeah. So the site where the drug is going to be tested at. So if you are using, for example, a CRO doing preclinical testing, the place where the animals are going to be administered that drug, that institution or an individual from that institution needs to be the one applying for the license.
Excellent. And I imagine that the same conditions apply not just for applying for studies with THC, but any Schedule I drug would have to follow the same type of processes with the same type of lead time requirements.
Yep, that's exactly correct.
So other than additional lead time and making sure that the facility, the applicant that will be conducting the studies, has the procedures and has the procedures in place and the ability to work with Schedule II through 5 licenses, and then applies for the Schedule I license. Are there any other conditions that separate studies conducted with Schedule I drugs from other types of drugs that are being evaluated?
Well, there are a few requirements that are unique to Schedule I as compared even to the other controlled substances. So there might be slightly different storage or dispensing or documentation requirements for Schedule I. So the applicant needs to be familiar with the DEA regulations, especially for first-time applicants. It's possible, I would wager to say even likely, that the DEA may do an on-site inspection. They're going to want to make sure that your drug storage is adequate, that your safe meets the requirements, and the facility should be prepared with adequate storage facilities and SOPs to support the DEA regulations. If you're considering starting up any Schedule I research at a CRO, it would be important to know if that CRO has been through that process, or at the very least, if they at least have the Schedule II through 5 licensing already, because that's a huge step towards already meeting the requirements for Schedule I. There'll be a little bit more they have to do beyond that, but the Schedule II license gets them pretty close to what they need for storage facilities.
Excellent. So it'd be interesting to have the DEA agents visiting the site.
Good times.
And I imagine it would be sort of challenging, as is everything in this state of the COVID pandemic, but we will see.
Yeah.
Well, excellent. Great discussion, Christina. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with me and with our audience. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at the contact information on your screen. For those of you in the audience, thank you for listening. If you haven't done so already, please check out our other podcasts, webinars, and materials available at altasciences.com. Until next time, thanks again. Goodbye.